Thank you so much for having me here. I appreciate especially the arrangements that Donna Martinez and Jane Stroop made in making this visit possible. The story of Jews acting as moneylenders in medieval Europe has been an accepted historical fact that doesn't need to be verified or proven. I'm going to suggest that it's one of the most erroneous stories in Jewish history because, as Gould suggests in this quote, it's one that we think we know best and therefore never scrutinize or question. The historical narrative with which some of you may be familiar goes like this. Jews were merchants during the early Middle Ages and moneylenders in the High Middle Ages. Jews were drawn, propelled, or pushed out of trade and into lending because they were uniquely positioned to fill a new economic niche, that of credit. European economy was expanding dramatically in the 12th and 13th centuries, but the church prohibited usury, preventing the easy flow of credit necessary for economic development. Jews, not being Christian, were not subject to the laws on usury on the one hand. On the other hand, Jews were prevented from owning land and joining craft guilds. This is still the myth here. As Christians moved into trade and pushed Jews out, Jews adapted their commercial expertise and accumulated capital to lending on interest. Strong centralizing monarchies in Western Europe protected and privileged Jewish money lending. For rulers would then ruthlessly squeeze out the surplus capital collected by Jewish creditors through special royal taxes levied on the Jewish population. Ironically and tragically, Jews, by providing credit badly needed in Europe, suffered an anti-Semitic backlash, even as Jewish money lending propelled Europe forward. This anti-Semitic backlash morphed into anti-Semitic fantasies, pogroms, and expulsions during the latter Middle Ages. Does this sound familiar to anyone? So this is the erroneous story that we think we know best, and that we includes both the general public and scholars, and even, or perhaps even particularly, Jewish studies scholars. The narrative continues to appear in the literature of the Anti-Defamation League, in Jewish history museums, in articles and books by established journalists, and by Jewish historians. Among the recent books that refer to it as a self-evident truth, we can point to Bottacini and Eckstein's The Chosen Few, How Education Shaped Jewish History, which came out with Princeton University Press in 2012. The research for this was supported by grants from the American National Science Foundation, the Israel Science Foundation. And their take on the medieval period is exemplified here in this quote. I'm sorry, there's a zero missing. Circa 1100, lending money at interest was the occupation par excellence of the Jews in England. And so on, going down to France and Germany. They were all engaged in money lending. Give you another example, Capitalism and the Jews, published in 2010 by Jerry Mueller, frames his discussion with the title and chapter, a chapter entitled The Long Shadow of Usury. And even the experts who study Jews and economy, whose books that were important for my own. Here's again a long quote from Jerry Mueller, such as Shylock's Children by Derek Pinzler, one of the most respected Jewish historians today, and Jonathan Karp's The Politics of Jewish Commerce, still rely on this narrative when dealing with the medieval period. This narrative, I would say, is riddled with errors. Really only two facts mixed up in the narrative are solid. There was economic growth in the 12th and 13th century in Europe, and there was the growth of what we call medieval antisemitism. Before scrutinizing and questioning this narrative, I'd like to make two prefatory comments. First, there are actually three prototypes of Jewish moneylenders tied to different historical periods and places. There's the medieval Jewish moneylender tied to 12th and 13th century England and northern France, and to a lesser extent German lands. There's Shylock, or the Jewish moneylender of 16th century Italy, and they're the court Jews of the 17th and 18th century, the Oppenheimers and Rothschilds. In the Anglo-American world today, Shylock is the dominant prototype for the Jewish moneylender. This is evident from the use of Shylock's name in studies like Shylock Reconsidered, Shylock's Children, Shylock's Daughters. In Nazi Germany, the court Jews were the dominant prototype of the Jewish moneylender. The first two German feature films made under the Nazis as anti-Semitic propaganda were on the Rothschilds and on a court Jew known as Yud Zeus. And this is a picture from the Nazi movie poster there of Yud Zeus. This last one was a great success, seen by 40 million European viewers, mandated for every SS a man to see, and I believe still banned in Germany today. All of these prototypes of the Jewish moneylender are linked together by negative stereotypes associating Jews and Judaism with money and money-making, with capitalism and commercialism. These stereotypes, in fact, did originate in the 12th and 13th century and are still with us today. In parts of Europe and North America that have been the center of Holocaust studies, we see these stereotypes diminishing, yet we still find them aired widely on the internet. And here is just a couple of videos, all within the last 5 to 10 years about the Rothschilds online. We have another example, the Occupy Wall Street movement of 2011. Shows how, on the one hand, the protester here collapses Jew, Zionist, and Wall Street, linking all through the old stereotype of the Jewish moneylender. But it shows also the counter-protests going on. So there's, we see a more complex picture here. Even according to an Anti-Defamation League survey, 19% of Americans still believe that Jews have too much control over Wall Street. And in Europe, the numbers are higher. Jews have too much power in the business world, or 22% in the UK and Germany, to highs of 60 and 73% in Spain and Hungary. Those statistics are from about 5 years ago. Okay, so that's the first comment, that we have this tripartite Jewish moneylender figure in different places and periods. And the second prefatory comment I'd like to make is about the Middle Ages. So what are we referring to when we say early Middle Ages or high Middle Ages? On the one hand, this is a rather simple question of periodization, right? What are the dates that we're talking about? But on the other hand, there's an underlying question about how the period is interpreted as a whole, how it's seen. I'd like to give you a quick peek into the perspective of contemporary scholars. So the medieval period runs from around 500 to 1500, the Common Era, marked on either end by great changes, the transformation of the late Roman Empire in the West into a series of barbarian kingdoms, and around 1500 with the Renaissance spreading to Northwest Europe and the Reformation underway. Because it's a 1,000-year period, historians have been accustomed to breaking it into 3 smaller periods known as early, high, and late Middle Ages. And today we'll be in the period of the high Middle Ages, focusing around 1100 to 1300. And this period comes to a sharp end in the 14th century with a series of famines early in the century, and then the Black Death in the mid-century. This period is considered a high point for European cultural creativity and institutional developments, propelled by a demographic boom and agricultural and commercial revolutions. Popular images of the Middle Ages focus on distinctive features of the High Middle Ages. So knights, castles, illuminated manuscripts, cathedrals. In short, the popular images emphasize the difference and distance of medieval Europe from the modern. It's seen as overwhelmingly religious, by which is understood Christian, as violent, for example, the Crusades, as culturally barbaric, they hadn't discovered the fork yet, and impoverished, with most people living at subsistence level. Professional historians, on the other hand, see this period as the origin of Europe and European culture. And they point to institutions such as the university, representative politics on a rudimentary level found in church councils and guilds, the establishment of urban growth, the origins of Western conceptions of romantic love, still with us today, rational thought, and notions of the individual, as well as the beginnings of market economy. Yes, market economy. Some medieval historians have even called this period of economic development a medieval commercial revolution, because trade and credit permeated all facets of medieval society, not only urban markets, but rural subsistence farming as well. Economic historians have written reams on credit banking and money lending during the 20th century without any reference to Jews. And I want to emphasize that last point. More recently, medieval historians have also focused on the darker side to the High Middle Ages, on the origins of intolerance and persecution, and they've focused specifically on several marginalized groups, among them Jews, heretics, and lepers. And they've seen this terrible legacy as something that culminates then in the genocides and ethnic cleansings of the 20th century. As Holocaust studies began emerging in the late 60s, medieval historians too began exploring the medieval origins of anti-Semitism in the High Middle Ages. While modern anti-Semitism has been defined as race-based political ideology, medieval anti-Semitism has been defined around the emergence of irrational fantasies. And here's an example of a host desecration. So these irrational fantasies are accusations that Jews ritually murdered Christian boys or used Christian blood for Jewish practices, like baking matzah, or desecrated the host, which by the 13th century, by 1215, was defined as the body of Christ in the doctrine of transubstantiation. So we see here two Jews that are stabbing the host, and the host is bleeding, showing the truth of that doctrine. Expulsions of Jewish communities follow soon after, culminating in the expulsions from Spain in 1492 and Portugal in 1497, so that by 1500, Western Europe is what the Nazis would call Judenrein. The Jewish communities are wiped out, except in the German and Italian regions, where the populations are now being contained in ghettos. I would suggest that the medieval Jewish moneylender could be considered a rational fantasy, not an irrational, but a rational fantasy that develops alongside these irrational ones. We do see in the 12th and 13th centuries, together with the growth of commercial economy, a greater concern about usury and more generally sinful or improper acts, which include hoarding, covetousness, greediness, cheating, stealing, and market exchanges. There's also a lot of anxiety around using ill-gotten gains for religious ends, alms, donations. And some of our evidence for these concerns comes from art. So we see here a sculpture of a usurer depicted with this kind of demonic cat peering over his shoulder. He's not Jewish. This figure is not Jewish. But one of the things that happens is that the usurer becomes identified with Jews and Jewishness, and so it becomes a symbol for these sinful economic practices in Christian theological literature and art. So the linkage of Jews and usury in Christian theological literature has been mistaken by Jewish historians as a description of social reality. I would suggest that the Jewish moneylender would be better understood as part of the development of medieval anti-Semitism, which occurs in these centuries. So that is, again, the appearance and spread of these myths of ritual murder, blood libel, host desecration. These myths survived in European culture. The economic stereotype, which was actually not as prominent as those other irrational fantasies in the medieval period, became the most prominent in the 19th and 20th centuries. So my book, The Myth of the Medieval Jewish Moneylender, which is circling around, I brought a copy for you all to see, the first volume, which is out just now. So it has at its core an empirical study of the best case for the traditional narrative, which says that most or all Jews were moneylenders in the High Middle Ages and working hand in glove with those royal administrations. So let me move here. So the best case is the Jewish community in 13th century England, where we have copious documentation. We have a system of loan chests established for Jews lending to Christians, and a special branch of the Royal Exchequer, which is resolving legal issues that come out of these loans. But even though there's copious evidence of lending, we are in a period in which Europe is just beginning to transition from an oral to a written culture, and in a period in which many records in a series have been lost. So one of the reasons that this narrative has not been scrutinized is that it's difficult to do the quantitative research from partial and piecemeal documents. So my approach has been to study the distribution of wealth in the Jewish community, that is to look at what percentage of the population would actually have been wealthy enough to be a professional moneylender, and where it's possible also to calculate loans to look at the extent of loans in the Jewish population. All right, so now I'm going to switch to my research and take you through some of that. I used here methods developed by British economic and demographic historians and adapted them to the study of a minority population. So again, all the document series are partial and fragmentary. So I have to tease out the extent of money lending from several different angles. So the first question I asked was, what percentage of the Jewish population was wealthy enough? And to do that, I looked at 4 taxes paid by the Jewish population over a 100-year period. So this represents taxes paid by the entire Jewish population of England. And I found really a staggering distribution of wealth. So if we see, I divided this into 4 equal population groups, and then I'm showing here the percentage which they paid. So the blue is the wealthiest quarter of the Jewish population, and they're paying typically 80% or more of a tax. So if the wealth had been distributed equally, each group, each color there would be 25% on the bars. So I hope that makes sense. Instead, we see the top quartile paying 80 to 99% in that tax of 1240, and we see the bottom quartile paying 2% or less. So that's the purple. Let's see if, I have a cursor. So this group up here. And so 75% of the Jewish population is represented by these top colors. So you can see that they hold, about 20% of the wealth altogether. That is, 75% of the taxpayers hold 20% of the wealth. Okay, you say, okay, so we see that some Jews are very, very wealthy and many are not very wealthy, some are very poor. How do these sums relate to living standards, and how do they compare to the Christian urban population? To answer this question, I aligned Jewish distribution of wealth with that of Christian urban populations. I took then studies of taxes paid by urban Christians and compared them to Jews. So most of the taxes here are by Christians. The two which are that we saw on the former slide, let's see if I can, there's my cursor, so are indicated by these 2 blue arrows. So you can see here in the Great Tallage, paid around 1275, is very close to that paid in the town of King's Lynn in 1275. We see over here the 1240 tax, which again looks very similar to the Newcastle on Tyne of 1296. So there's a great difference in the time period there. But you can see overall, right, there's several other taxes thrown in here, that overall, the range in the 13th century, the Jewish taxpayers have their assessed wealth is equivalent to that of the Christian urban groups. So unlike before, the chart before where I was looking at the percentage of tax that a group paid, here the other historians did their research by looking at the amount of wealth that each group held. So group 1 is under £1, group 2, £1 to £2, 19 shillings, and so on. So it's a good provides a good means for comparison. Okay, so even with this, what you might ask, well, what does it mean, right? What kind of professions are we talking about that have an assessed wealth of £1 per year, and so on? And here I used research of another British historian on standards of living in the 13th century. And you can see, let's see if I can get the cursor here again. Here we go. So you can see here, I lined up merchants in this column. All of merchants from the low end to the high end are in that group 5 category. Craftsmen and servants range from group 5 down, all the way down. So we find middling craftsmen down to the poor and vagrant are in that group 4 and down. So that's where that 75% of the Jewish population, right, is at this level. And then we can also compare it to the rural communities and landowners. Okay. You'll notice also down here at the very, well, let me actually move to a different slide here. So this one, I've taken the two taxes of 1240, 1275, and those are the red and the blue, indicated the number of Jews in each of those categories. So we can see again here, you can easily see that group 5 is a small selection compared to the majority of the Jewish population. And you can see down here, I have listed those who are exempt from tax. So that's a speculative number, and I want to walk you through how I came up with that number. I took the estimated Jewish population in England, which is somewhere between 2,500 and 5,000. And from that, I was able to use what demographic historians call a household multiplier. So we know in medieval households, there was typically between 3 and 5 people on average in a household, less in urban centers and more in the countryside. And I was able to then calculate, based on those, what percentage of the Jewish population was too poor to pay tax at all. In other words, what percentage was exempt? What I came up with are, I think the numbers in the middle are, I think, quite reasonable figures. So it's between 50 and 60% of the population. So that's 1 in 2 of the Jewish population were too poor to pay tax at all. And that number is actually a quite good number because if we look at Christian urban populations, we find that it's 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 is paying tax, whereas here all I'm suggesting is that it's 1 in 2. And if it's in the countryside, it's more like 1 in 5 households are paying tax. Okay, so far I've described how much wealth members of the Jewish population have. But what about lending? Okay, that's what really counts, right? In order to look at that, our best records are when the Crown closed the loan chest down and took inventories of all the loans that were in it in order to seize outstanding loans in lieu of taxes. So the IRS has different methods today. That was the Crown of England's method at that time. And what I found is that there were, on average, about 60% of taxpayers that didn't have a loan anywhere that owed money to the government. So that told me, okay, we have a lot of taxpayers. So again, this I think goes back to your question, and yet they're not lending. There were a couple of towns where, the town of Lincoln in particular was special because we have a full census of the Jewish population and what they paid, and then we have a 20-year record of that loan chest. And so this is that's the first page, the census, really, and what they paid for the tax. And based on that, I could say, and Lincoln was one of the most important towns, fourth, I think, largest town in England in the 13th century, that 72% of Jews in the town had no loans at all. But you can see there's some, that 3% there have 50 plus loans. Those are definitely professional moneylenders. Even that, I would say top 10% look like they're involved in professional money lending. But that still leaves us with 90% of the Jewish population that aren't professional lenders, and most, 3/4, that probably don't even have a loan at all. Right, so why then do we get this myth? Okay, the reason I would say is surprising, even counterintuitive, right? It's not the result of simple spread of antisemitism. Jewish and philosemitic German scholars in the 19th century accepted the stereotype, but they turned it on its head and they used it as an argument for Jewish inclusion in the German nation. Jewish scholars were the first to do so, and then it entered mainstream academic discourse with the German political economist Wilhelm Roscher. And in his day, he would have been a household name in 19th century Germany, like Keynes or Hayek today. He wrote an essay on the Jewish economic function that was written specifically in response to the rise of political anti-Semitism following the stock market crash of 1873. And he argued that medieval Jewry had fulfilled an essential economic function for medieval Europe, and so too in modern Germany, and therefore they would make good citizens. So too, medieval Jews unjustly suffered a reactionary backlash, just as they were in modern Germany. His work then influenced widely academics of the stature of Werner Sombart, Max Weber, and through them then generations really of sociologists, historians, and political thinkers. Roscher's historical narrative still circulates today despite our many studies on medieval credit and banking that, again, don't refer to Jews at all. They don't need Jews to explain economic development. Roscher's philosemitic and liberal economic argument has been so powerful, I would suggest, because it didn't challenge the stereotype on Jews and money, but it countered, right, its ugly barb in two ways. It recast usury as a beneficial public good, and it recast opposition to Jewish emancipation as reactionary and economically ignorant. Okay, so to conclude, right, the legacy of this philosemitic narrative is mixed. The historical narrative has not been simply an academic narrative, but a cultural memory, right? It continues to shape Jewish self-understanding. Self-perceptions of a mercantile money-lending Jewish population undergird early 20th century Zionist imperatives of returning to the land and the Zionist success in rooting a wandering Jew in the blooming desert, however mythical that desert may have been. And it resonates with American Jewish immigrant success, as that book on Jews and capitalism unabashedly begins, "We Jews are good at making money." But the sooner we get rid, I would suggest, of this false historical narrative, the better. While Roscher's liberal philosemitic narrative combats negative stereotypes about grasping and greedy Jews by emphasizing the beneficial Jewish economic function, it doesn't get rid of the stereotypes at the bottom. And it can be flipped at any moment and become a dangerous anti-Semitic source. Okay, thank you.